But if there is a surplus, then the opposition might well claim it as their own, as it was the government that set the parameters for the current financial year. But remember, it was actually the opposition, as it was now, that actually was in government for some of that time. The Shadow Treasurer is Angus Taylor, who joins me now. Angus, many thanks for your time. Is the budget going to be in surplus or not when the government hands it down on Tuesday next week?
Well, I don't know, Ross, but it should be. There's no doubt about that. It absolutely should be. If we're to have an inflation-fighting budget, and that's what we need most of all, there should be a surplus. But most importantly, Ross, it should be maintained into the future. It's no good running a surplus for 1 year and then running the budget off a cliff. That will be inflationary. We need a sustained balancing of the budget, a containment of the growth in spending. We don't need a big spending and big taxing budget. That's the last thing we need right now as we're facing deep inflationary pressures. We have the highest core inflation of the G7, Ross, ahead of the US, UK, Canada, Europe, and we need to make sure that's being contained. It's a tax on everybody. There's real pain being felt out there, and we need a budget that recognises that. In terms of surplus, I should also say that from when the economy opened up in late 2021 through to the May election, we were in surplus. And so there's no excuse here. Labor should be delivering surpluses, but they should be maintaining them. And that's the real test for the budget.
What about those aged care workers? It's $11 billion worth of pay rises for them over the next 4 years. And yet, quite clearly, there's some in the community who really are doing it tough. Do they deserve those wage rises or not?
Well, I think everyone deserves a government that avoids the biggest tax of all on everyone, which is inflation. I mean, when you've got core inflation running at 6.6 and headline inflation running faster than that, of course, that's a tax on everybody and everything, Ross. And everybody feels that pain, whether you're an aged care worker, you're a tradie, you're an accountant, you name it, a nurse, everyone is feeling that pain. And so the best thing we can see in this budget is inflation-fighting credentials and an inflation-fighting outcome. And that outcome is government managing its spending, because if government doesn't manage its spending, households and businesses have to do the work for it.
So what about those aged care workers? Do they deserve that pay rise or not? I mean, it is $11 billion.
Well,
it's a big number.
They deserve higher real wages. The Fair Work Commission has made that decision and we respect it. But the best way to get higher real wages, Ross, is lower inflation. I mean, you know, that's very straightforward. And that's higher real wages for absolutely everybody. It's not just aged care workers who are feeling pain. They are feeling pain, but it's right across the economy. I was out in Sutherland during the week. And down in South Australia and Victoria, I've been seeing businesses and the pain that's being felt, both on the customer side, their customers having to trade down and manage their budgets in a very tight way, as well as in the businesses themselves. And of course, the best way we can relieve some of those pressures on everybody across the economy is for the government to manage its spending, to manage its budget and deliver ongoing budget balance, ongoing budget surpluses. It's not good enough just to rely on what was inherited. They've got to do it into the future as well.
OK, so you talk to a lot of businesses out there, and we saw this week the Reserve Bank raise interest rates because of what it saw as inflation in the services industry. Has inflation escaped into the broader economy? And is it going to be harder to control now for government and for the Reserve Bank?
Well, it's very clear that it's not sector specific anymore. It's certainly not just goods. It's gone into services in particular. That's where we're seeing enormous strength. But it's across the board. And this is the point. This is no longer inflation that's come from Vladimir Putin and the Ukraine. This is inflation coming from Canberra. It's across the board. And it's Canberra that can help to address the issue, that can take pressure off. We know, it's one of the first lessons you learn in macroeconomics, Ross, as you know, that if governments contain their spending, it takes pressure off inflation, takes pressure off interest rates, and that's what we need to see. You know, this government and the Treasurer talks a big game on restraint. It's no good to talk the talk, you've got to walk the walk, and that means balanced budgets into the future, managing spending, making sure that the economy is growing faster than spending, taking that pressure off interest rates, and taking pressure off the Reserve Bank. In particular, because if the Reserve Bank can see that the government's taking pressure off inflation, They don't have to do as much of the work, which is very painful for so many people.
But one reason why the budget might be in surplus this year is because inflation has pushed up people's wages, which has therefore pushed them into higher tax brackets. So in other words, it's almost an artificial reason as to why the government has got significant amounts of revenue coming through the door.
Well, when people are facing real cost of living pressures, and we know that we're going to see a slowing economy in the coming months and years, we need to have a strong economy coming out of this high inflationary situation. The worst thing you can do is try to solve the problem with higher taxes. That's not the answer. Now, one of the reasons people are seeing higher taxes, and we've seen this in the last national accounts, tax payments are going up dramatically. One of those reasons is inflation is pushing people's incomes up into higher tax brackets. So you get your pay rise, great. The problem is that more and more of your income is going into high tax brackets, and so your tax rate is going up. Your average tax rate is going up. And that's called bracket creep. It's real pain out there. Again, this is another side effect of inflation. Inflation is an insidious tax. It's both a tax in terms of all your goods and services being more expensive, but you also end up paying more tax to the government. And of course, we know that is exactly what's happening.
But the consequence of a slowing economy is going to be rising unemployment. I've done back-of-the-envelope calculations and worked out that if the unemployment rate rises from 3.5% to 4.5%, which many suggest, that's 160,000 jobs. But it's not just 160,000 jobs. It's roughly $4 billion worth of revenue per annum that doesn't go into the budget.
Which is why we need a sustainable, balanced budget. We've got a very strong jobs market right now. We've had that coming out of COVID, and that's part of the reason why there has been such a strong budget coming out of the pandemic. And we've had very strong commodity prices, of course, Ross, as you well know, and that's brought lots of money into government coffers. But if the government is to take pressure off inflation, it needs to be able to run a balanced budget even without those tailwinds in a much more normal situation. And that means it needs to contain its spending.
Ongoing spending, structural spending, which is the National Disability Insurance Scheme, which is going to only rise regardless of what happens. There's defence spending that comes into the future. With that spending, and of course with constraints on government revenues, is inevitable in the future that debts rise and Australia's AAA credit ratings at risk.
Well, it's not inevitable. I mean, Labor keeps talking about the structural deficit. Labor always has structural deficits because they love to spend money. But it's how you manage your budget. And the best predictor of future performance is past performance. Between 2013 and 2019, the way we managed this and brought the budget back into balance was to make sure the economy grows faster than your spending. Even though you've got big spending programs, and we pushed up defence spending and the NDIS very dramatically during that period, but we still managed to balance the budget. And that's by just having a process where you're absolutely committed to budget balance, you're absolutely committed to having an economy growing faster than your spending, and you're continually pushing things back into the black. That's what we need to see. Now, some of those big spending programs like the NDIS, there does need to be work on them. We all want a successful, sustainable NDIS, and that's why we've said to the Labor Party, we'll work with you. We said that in the budget and reply speech last year. We'll work with you to contain and manage that spending and deliver a sustainable NDIS. We've heard nothing from them, but these are the right things to do, and this is how we make sure we take pressure off inflation, take pressure off Australian households and business budgets.
Angus Taylor, good to catch up with you today from your electorate in Hume in Goulburn, and you have a great day.
Good on you. Thanks, Ross.